Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share the March 2025 clubs from Spellbinders. This here is the wax seal of the month called Pattern Perfection, as well as the basic wax bead mix kit. This is the better press of the month, which is called Quilted Memories. I'm going to do a separate video with a bunch of different techniques using this because it's so versatile. We also have the embossing folder of the month called Mosaic Memories. This coordinates well with the stencil of the month, as well as that better press of the month. Both of them, the stencils from the stencil of the month, coordinate with each of the patterns from the better press of the month, as well as the embossing folder of the month. And I love the fact that they did that. It makes it so fun to create and gives it a lot more versatility. Then we have our stamp of the month, which is called Nearest and Dearest. Some great sentiments as well as a coordinating die that cuts them out. Then we have the glimmer of the month called We Are Family. So another great set with a bunch of different sentiments. I always love when you can do a bunch of sentiments at once. The stitching die of the month here is called Diamond Knit, and it creates a really fun background that looks kind of like argyle to me. We also have the large die of the month called Family and Friends Vignettes. There's a really pretty vignette there, as well as dinosaur, a dog, and some floral. So there's a lot of different elements to that. This is the die of the month called Fairways and Fishtails. Perfect for masculine cards, fish themed as well as golf themed. And then the caboodle item for this month is this better press plate, which is called Fairways and Fishtails Sentiments. Coordinates perfectly with that die of the month. Again, perfect for masculine cards. Last but certainly not least is the 3D embossing folder of the month called Floral Fence of Togetherness. The florals on the bottom left there are absolutely stunning. So this is part one of 3 different parts sharing the clubs. I wanted to break it up. Like I said before, I wanted to do the better press in a separate video. For this one, I'm going to focus on that die of the month, the Fairways and Fishtails. I'm going to bring in some other of the clubs as well, the wax seal of the month, as well as the bonus caboodle item, Fairways and Fishtail Sentiments. We're also going to use the embossing folder of the month, as well as the coordinating stencil to go with it. So to start off with, I'm going to do the wax seal of the month and create a wax seal with the white beads from that basic mix. The reason I'm doing this is, to me, this wax seal looks a little bit like a golf ball, and I think it would coordinate really well with the golf part of the Fairways and Fishtails die set. So I heated up my wax and I'm pouring it onto my silicone craft mat. I'm using the wax starter kit here. I always use it. It has all the basic items for creating these wax seals. Now, when I took my little tea light out of my box, I broke the wick on it. So my flame isn't very high. So my wax is a little bit thicker than it normally is. And that's the reason why. I will be using this wax seal of the month in one of my other club videos, but for this one, I'm only creating this one seal to create the golf ball. The best way to clean out that little scoop that you're melting the wax in is when it's still very hot, use a clean piece of paper towel and just wipe it clean. You can get it really, really clean that way. I am using some detailed scissors to cut the outside rim around that seal, and like I said, to me that looks a little bit like a golf ball. Obviously not exact, but I think for what we're creating, it's going to work perfectly. Before I do anything else on the cards, I'm going to create my background with the stitching die of the month. So I'm using some Raindrop Cardstock. This is the lighter of the blues. I couldn't decide if I wanted to use the lighter or the darker one. And in the end, I chose the lighter one simply because that piece of cardstock was slightly bigger than my darker one. And really either one would work. It's just going to create a slight variation in the look. Now I did tape my die to my paper simply because my paper was exactly the same size as the outside edge of that die. Ran it through my Platinum 6 machine, and before doing any stitching, I'm just using a die pick to pick out all of those little stitching holes. It's much easier to create the card when all those holes are out of there. Now, the other thing that I'm doing is I'm going to use this underwater tunnel die set. This is from a release from last spring. I want it to use or want to use it on the bottom. I thought it looked a little bit like a golf green, a little bit with the wavy edges. So I'm trying to create that look to it. Now there's no point in me stitching underneath where that piece is going to go. So I laid my die on there and just did a rough pencil line where that edge was going to be. And then I'm going to use that as a guide. Now my rough pencil line is inside the die, so it is not exact. I'm just wanting to make sure that I have all of the stitching in all of the areas that need it and that are going to be visible. Now for this particular one, there are kind of little squares that go on the crosses there. And when you use a stitching die, it shows you exactly where to stitch, which makes it really, really nice and easy. I'm using some silver floss here because I thought it would coordinate nicely with the rest of the elements on the card. And I didn't want to take too much away from this background pattern. I just kind of wanted to add a little bit of metallic shine to it. Whenever I'm doing stitching, I always use some Best Ever craft tape to stitch or to stick the end of my floss on the back side. For this particular one, I'm doing that between each one of the squares. Sometimes for some of the squares, I'm going to need to cut my floss to work on the next square. It just secures that floss. Easy way to do it. And you only need a tiny little piece of the tape. This background is going to be glued down, so you're really not going to see it anyways. When I started this particular one, I had a little bit of leftover floss from a previous project. If you have to get that, or if that needle comes off your floss, what I like to do is wet the ends, put them between my thumb and my pointer finger on my left hand side, hold it nice and flat, and then just kind of wiggle that needle back and forth, and it usually threads it really, really easily. This is something that I've done for years, and anytime I use it, most of the time I get it threaded in the first try. Sometimes I'll have to try a second or third time, but most of the time it just takes one try. So I'm going to continue, most of my stitching I do off screen, but I'm going to continue to do my stitching on the areas that are exposed. Now the one thing that I did was I made sure that the bottom layer was going the same way and the top layer was going the same way. So if you look at the floss, all of the top layers are going from the top right to the bottom left. Another fun way I think to do this would be to weave the floss in between the layers and create kind of a woven look to it. I didn't do that for this because I didn't think it was going to be that noticeable, but on something, say, variegated, I think that could be, like with variegated floss, I think that could be fun to do your stitching one way, and then when you go the other way to kind of weave it between to create kind of a woven look with that floss. And I think with variegated floss, you'd see that a little bit more. Once I have my whole background here stitched, I can glue this down to a solid piece of cardstock. I always love to glue my stitch pieces to a solid piece or another die cut stitched cardstock piece, not actually stitched, but just a die cut piece to really sandwich those floss layers in between the two pieces of cardstock. It also makes it easier for gluing those layers down onto, or gluing that stitch piece down onto a card, simply because you're gluing it from cardstock to cardstock and those threads or flosses are sandwiched in between the cardstock. So for this one, knowing I was going to be gluing it to a solid piece, I did that before putting it onto my card front. To glue it down, I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. This is perfect for large areas, but it's also perfect for small areas. For this instance, I think it works really well to get that glue in between all of the different layers and different areas so that it's sandwiched really nicely. While waiting for it to dry, I'm going to use some sewing clips. It just holds those pieces together, make sure that glue has some good contact. And this is going to secure everything. Because that floss is inside there, when I go to glue this onto the front of the card, it's just going to be easier. Again, like I said before, I'll be gluing cardstock to cardstock, which makes it a lot easier. I have some Fern cardstock here for creating my green. That dark cardstock on the background of my card, by the way, is called Partly Cloudy. Some of these are older cardstock colors. Some of these have been brought into the new line. I am trying to use up some of my old cardstock colors to use them up, as well as the fact that I figure there's a lot of people out there that still have some of the old colors. So once I have my green here die cut, I can glue that onto my card front. Now, when you saw me put that die down, you could see that I wasn't concerned with getting a complete die cut because those areas that are not completely die cut are going to go off the card anyways, are going to be trimmed off. So there's no point in worrying about that. This is the die set that I used here. This one's called Underwater Tunnel. I realized at this point that I didn't actually show the die set. Once my glue is dry, I can use my shears to cut off those extra pieces, and we have the background for our card completed. Now, I noticed as I was cutting the bottom part that there's just a little sliver of that darker cardstock that goes or extends out from the lighter stitched background. So I just trimmed that off using my guillotine trimmer. For the front of this card, the part of the Fairways and Fishtails die set, it has a really large golf club, as well as it also has a whole golf ball die set. I'm not using that here, I'm using that wax seal, and then a little oval for the hole. So I'm using that Barely Art glue to glue this down as well. And then I'm also going to grab my large acrylic block and just put that on here to hold it in place. This is something I do often when I'm creating. It just makes everything lie nice and flat, holds it down, and frees up my hands for doing other things and continuing on. So I'm going to use that bonus item, the Fairways and Fishtails Sentiments set. I'm using that in my Better Press system. I have some scrap piece of Hammermill cardstock here, and I'm using Versamark ink to ink that plate up, and then I will press it through my Platinum 6 machine. Now I'm going to emboss these sentiments with some silver embossing powder. It's going to coordinate beautifully with the silver from the golf club, as well as my silver floss from stitching background die set. You could also use whatever color you want if you're using different colors than I am, or you can just use regular ink. That would work as well. I always love the look of the press plate sentiments with the embossing because it just gives them that extra dimension. And having a die set right in here that is going to die cut it out makes it really, really easy. Now, while I was putting the embossing powder on that press sentiment, there's an area on those two bottom sentiments that doesn't have embossing powder on there. It must not have had ink on the plate. Fortunately, I wasn't planning on using either of the sentiments for this set here. I was planning on using a couple from the top. One of them is going to be for this card, and the other one is going to be for my second card here. So I didn't have to redo it, but you definitely want to make sure that you ink up your plates completely. I thought I had. I clearly hadn't. So once I have that heat embossed, I can put my die on there. I do like to tape it in place with some Best Ever craft tape just to make sure that it holds and stays in the right spot and my die doesn't move and shift on me. With that done, I can take those sentiments out and put them to the side. Again, the ones that weren't complete, I just tossed them. Because I had a little bit of extra cardstock on that scrap, I just off screen die cut that a second time, and I'm using that on the back of my sentiment just to give it a little bit of extra dimension. This is one of those steps that totally could be eliminated if you don't want or care for that dimension. Only reason I did it was because I had that cardstock, and rather than putting it in my scrap drawer, I just figured I might as well use it up. I hadn't intended to originally, but again, because I had it there, it was ready to go, I figured I might as well use it up. I put my front or my panel here on the front of my cardstock. I like to use some super thick cardstock for my card bases. Don't necessarily need super thick cardstock sometimes, but I really love having really sturdy card bases. Glued on my sentiment and then glued on that wax seal for the golf ball there and let that completely dry. And here's the final result. It has so much dimension and so much texture between the stitching for that background as well as the dimension of the wax seal for that golf ball. I absolutely love the final result of it. For the second card, once again, I'm using that Fairways and Fishtails die of the month set. For my background, I'm going to use the embossing folder of the month as well as the coordinating stencil of the month to color it. I have some Raindrop Cardstock here to use for that background. And I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending with that stencil just to create almost the look of a sunrise. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more stylized because I'm using an embossing folder in the stencils. Another option here would be to not do the embossing folder and just do the stencils if you want. Again, it just gives it a little bit of pattern and texture in the background. This is another step that you could totally eliminate it if you wanted to have just a plain background to it. Just thought it might look a little bit more interesting. So with that background done, I'm using my sticky mat and I put down that embossed piece of cardstock, and then I'm going to grab the two stencils from this set that coordinate with this embossed background. Now, as you can see, when I put my cardstock, and this is a piece that is 4¼ by 5½ inches, I put it to the side of my embossing folder, and you can see that this stencil of the month doesn't go all the way. So the stencil of the month is about 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, so it doesn't stencil the entire area of that embossed background. So if you want to use your stencil with your embossing folder, you do want to keep in mind what areas you want stenciled, because it's basically just the center of that embossing folder if you want the whole thing stenciled. Another option would be to stencil your background first and then match it into your embossing folder. For the look that I was going for, I didn't necessarily need the entire thing stenciled. Not that I had planned to do it this way. I wasn't even thinking about what area was going to be stenciled and what wasn't, but it ended up being a happy accident because I had already wanted to do the bottom part of it a little bit darker so that it looked like water. So I'm using 4 different colors of distress ink here. The first color was Abandoned Coral, then Wilted Violet, then Stormy Sky, and then Chipped Sapphire. So I used some scrap cardstock to make sure that I wasn't getting ink on the edge of that stencil. And then I used that same cardstock to mask the top off. And I'm just doing that same stenciling, but this time, or ink blending, sorry, but this time I'm not using that stencil. I'm just doing the water part of the bottom of the card. I'm using some large Spellbinders ink blending brushes. I don't necessarily want my colors to be super dark. And by using the big blending brushes from Spellbinders, I can control it a little bit. I can make sure that I don't get super dark colors. I can always go over it if I want the colors to be darker than I have done, but I'd rather be lighter and have to go over it again to make it darker than to accidentally get too much color on there. To frame it, I'm using that Chipped Sapphire just around the edges, being a little bit heavier towards the bottom, a little bit lighter around the top. Again, this embossed background and the stencil background is more for pattern and just to add a little bit of interest. If this is not your cup of tea, again, you can eliminate this. You could just use ink blending on some cardstock for the background or just have a solid color background. And I think you get a great result either way because there's so much detail in the die cuts. So I trimmed that embossed background down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, and I'm gluing it to my card base, and I'll put my acrylic block on there to hold it down while it's dried. I have to assemble my fisherman, so I might as well let this sit and dry while I'm doing that. I have all the pieces already die cut off to the side, and when you die cut them, you actually get 2 different fishing rods with lines, so you can choose which one you want to do. When I was doing my cutting, I had no idea which one I was going to want to choose, so I die cut both of them. I think the thinner, narrower one would work better for a vertical card. I chose to do a horizontal one here, and you can see when I go to glue it on that I still have a little bit of that line going over the edge. If you were to do it this way, you definitely would want to use it for a card that you were either handing someone or use a larger envelope for it. But just be aware that it will possibly do that. Another option would be to angle it a little bit different. I don't fish, so I don't know which angles are realistic and which ones aren't. So I just got creative and let it go off of the card a little bit. For my fish, I have some holographic cardstock that I used to die cut it and just glued it right together. There's 2 different layers to it. I thought it would work perfect for a fish. Another option, if you don't have that holographic cardstock, is it looks exactly like Prism Glimmer Foil. So if you have some solid hot foiling with Prism Glimmer Foil that you didn't want to use on a card or whatnot, you could die cut that. It works perfectly as an alternative. I just happened to have these scraps of this holographic cardstock and it just worked for what I was wanting to do. I also have some matte silver cardstock that I used to create that little pail and layered those together. I did 2 fish here, one for at the end of the fishing line and one to kind of stick out of that bucket, just for something a little bit different. I wanted that holographic in 2 different areas. With the main pieces together, I can start to assemble my card. Now, the only thing that I haven't glued together yet is the dock. So there is a long strip that works for the top of the dock, and then there are 3 wooden pillars for the bottom. That long strip is also what I used for the handle or for the, I don't know what the parts of golf clubs are called, part of the golf club that the bottom part, the silver part, went onto. I should ask my husband, he golfs, I just don't. So once I had my card side there or on top of there, I could easily choose where I wanted those wood pillars to go. I ended up just doing one at each end and then one in the center. Now my pier here is going to be too big for the card or too tall for the card if I want that fisherman to stay within the card. So I put it down a little bit lower. Once it's totally dry, I will use those shears again to trim it down and cut it off. These fit on this horizontal card, you can see, because of the way that I've adjusted it, other than my fishing line here that, as I said before, goes over top. Again, it would definitely be very suited for a vertical card if you didn't want your pieces to go outside of the lines there, or outside of the card. Another option here would be to do a 5x7 card. I tend to prefer 4¼ by 5½ inch cards for the most part. There are sometimes when I do a larger card, sometimes because it's needed, sometimes because I feel like it. Most of the time it's because it's needed because of the larger size of the elements that I'm using or creating with. It just works better for the design I have in my head. But again, most of the time I prefer A2. Not really sure why. And for this one, I didn't want to create a larger card. I wanted it to stay as an A2 card. So once I have that fishing line there, and you can see that I did adjust it a little bit to try to make sure it wasn't going too high over top of the edge of the card, I put my acrylic block on there and got my sentiment, glued that over the center of the card. You can put your sentiment wherever you want. You could even put it on the inside of the card if you want. But because it's nice and bright white, I thought it coordinated well or tied in with the outside mat of the card. So here is that finished fishing themed card here. I love the fact that some of the clubs focus on masculine themed cards. I think they're going to be really great to create with. I also love that embossed and stenciled background. Again, it just adds a little bit of interest, but you could easily eliminate it. Then we have our golf one with that stitched background and the large golf club and the wax seal golf ball. Perfect for a golf lover, and I did it in masculine shades or colors, but you could easily do it as a feminine version as well. Thank you so much for joining me for the March 2025 Spellbinders Clubs Part 1. I will have Part 2 up soon, as well as a Part 3. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Have a fantastic day.